What if the Cold War never actually ended? It just changed its uniform. For 30 years, the world was told a single story. Democracy won, markets triumphed, history itself was finished. But in the wreckage of that certainty, three great rivalries have grown into something that looks, sounds, and moves eerily like the conflict our grandparents lived through. Missiles again fly over European cities. Warships again shadow each other in contested straits. Chip factories have become as strategically vital as oil fields once were. This is the story of how the world slid, almost without anyone agreeing to it, into a new Cold War, and why some of the sharpest minds in global politics still argue about whether that name is even the right one. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and with it fell an entire architecture of global rivalry that had defined nearly half a century of human history. 2 years later, the Soviet Union itself dissolved, leaving the United States as the world's sole superpower. Political scientist Francis Fukuyama famously declared at the end of history, the final ideological triumph of liberal democracy and market capitalism over every rival system. For a decade, this seemed almost true. Russia, humiliated and impoverished, struggled through economic collapse. China was still, in Western eyes, a developing country slowly opening its markets. NATO, an alliance built to contain a nation that no longer existed in that form, searched for a new purpose. But underneath this unipolar calm, three separate fault lines were quietly widening. The first ran through Moscow. Throughout the 1990s, NATO began admitting former Warsaw Pact states, Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and later pushed further east to the Baltic states, which had once been part of the Soviet Union itself. Western leaders framed this as the free choice of sovereign nations seeking security and prosperity. Russian leaders, across the political spectrum, framed it as a betrayal of informal understandings reached at the end of the Cold War, and as an encirclement of Russia's traditional sphere of influence. This grievance would smolder for 2 decades before igniting. The second fault line ran through Beijing. China's accession to the World Trade Organization in 2001 was celebrated in Washington as proof that economic liberalization would inevitably produce political liberalization, that a richer China would become a freer, more cooperative China, integrated peacefully into the American-led order. Chinese leaders had other ideas. They embraced markets without embracing multi-party democracy, built a state-guided capitalism that could outcompete Western firms in strategic industries, and used the wealth generated by global trade to modernize a military that, for most of the reform era, had been a shadow of America's. The third fault line was subtler, a growing sense across much of the developing world, the so-called Global South, that the post-Cold War order had been built by and for the wealthy nations of the West, with rules on trade, finance, and intervention that rarely seemed to apply evenly. Cracks began to show earlier than most people remember. In August 2008, Russian forces invaded Georgia after a dispute over the breakaway regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. The first time since the Soviet collapse that Moscow had used direct military force beyond its own borders to reassert influence over a former Soviet republic. The war lasted only 5 days, and Western reaction was muted. Many historians now regard it as the first real tremor of the new Cold War, a signal that went largely unheeded. The 2008 global financial crisis, originating in American housing markets and Wall Street banks, shattered another pillar of the post-Cold War narrative, the idea that American-style capitalism was simply superior. Chinese officials, who had weathered the crisis far better through state intervention, began speaking more openly about an alternative development model, one that didn't require Western-style democracy as a precondition for prosperity. Then, in 2014, came the moment many scholars point to as the true beginning of the new Cold War. After mass protests in Kyiv toppled Ukraine's Russia-aligned president, Russia annexed Crimea and began backing separatist militias in eastern Ukraine's Donbass region. The United States and European Union responded with the first major package of economic sanctions against Russia since the Soviet era. It was the first time since 1991 the European border had been redrawn by force, and it shattered the assumption that great power territorial conquest belonged to history books. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, China began constructing artificial islands atop reefs in the South China Sea, fortifying them with military airstrips and radar installations, and asserting expansive maritime claims that overlapped with those of Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Brunei. An international tribunal in The Hague ruled these claims had no legal basis under international law. China simply ignored the ruling. By the mid-2010s, three separate strands, Russian revanchism in Europe, Chinese assertiveness in Asia, and a broader crisis of confidence in the liberal international order, had begun to braid together into something analysts started calling, with increasing frequency, a new Cold War. It was not, historians are careful to note, a perfect replay of 1947 to 1991. There was no single unifying ideological bloc facing America the way Soviet communism once did. Russia and China had their own historical suspicions of each other, dating back to a bitter ideological split in the 1960s. But the structural features were unmistakably familiar. Rival great powers, competing spheres of influence, proxy conflicts, information warfare, and an arms race that increasingly extended into space, cyberspace, and semiconductor factories. If Europe was the first theater of the new Cold War, the Indo-Pacific became its center of gravity, and the rivalry between Washington and Beijing its defining axis. Unlike the Soviet-American Cold War, which involved two economies with almost no meaningful trade between them, the U.S.-China relationship began as one of the most deeply intertwined economic partnerships in human history, which is precisely what made its unraveling so consequential. The turning point came during Donald Trump's first presidency, beginning in 2018, when the United States imposed sweeping tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars in Chinese goods, citing intellectual property theft, forced technology transfers, and an unsustainable trade imbalance. China retaliated with its own tariffs on American agricultural exports. What started as a trade dispute rapidly metastasized into something broader, a fight over who would control the technologies of the 21st century. Washington began restricting the export of advanced semiconductor manufacturing equipment to China, reasoning that cutting-edge chips underpin everything from smartphones to fighter jets to artificial intelligence systems, and that allowing Beijing unfettered access would erode America's military and economic edge. Beijing, in turn, poured state resources into building an independent chip industry, restricted exports of rare earth minerals critical to Western defense and clean energy manufacturing, and accelerated a long-term strategy of technological self-reliance. Taiwan sits at the molten core of this rivalry. The self-governing island, home to the world's most advanced semiconductor manufacturer, has been governed separately from mainland China since the Chinese Civil War ended in 1949. Beijing regards Taiwan as a breakaway province that must eventually be reunified with the mainland, by force if necessary, and has never renounced the option of invasion. Washington maintains no formal diplomatic recognition of Taiwan, but is bound by domestic law to provide it with defensive weapons, a deliberately ambiguous posture historians call strategic ambiguity. Throughout the 2020s, Chinese military aircraft carried out increasingly large exercises encircling the island, testing Taiwan's air defenses and rehearsing blockade scenarios, while American and Allied warships conducted freedom of navigation patrols through the Taiwan Strait. The rivalry also reshaped alliances across the region. The United States revitalized older partnerships and built new ones. The Quad, bringing together the US, Japan, India, and Australia. AUKUS, a security pact with Britain and Australia centered on nuclear-powered submarines, and deepened bilateral defense ties with the Philippines amid its own confrontations with Chinese Coast Guard vessels in the South China Sea. China, for its part, deepened its no-limits partnership with Russia, expanded the BRICS economic grouping to include new members, and positioned itself as the natural economic partner for much of the developing world through its Belt and Road Infrastructure Initiative. By the mid-2020s, under Trump's second term, the relationship had entered a new and more transactional phase. A bruising, renewed trade war in 2025 gave way to a series of high-level summits between Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping, culminating in a Beijing meeting and a trade truce that both sides described using the phrase strategic stability. Though, as analysts of the Council on Foreign Relations observed, Washington and Beijing meant noticeably different things by that phrase. For the United States, stability meant transactions, agricultural purchases, aircraft deals, negotiated tariff relief. For China, it meant something closer to a formal recognition of its status and interests as a rising power whose core interests, including Taiwan, must be respected. Entering 2026, expert surveys found opinion almost evenly split on whether the relationship would grow more antagonistic, more cooperative, or simply stay the same, a sign of just how genuinely uncertain this rivalry's trajectory remains, even to those who study it most closely. What makes the U.S.-China contest historically distinct from the original Cold War is this entanglement. Soviet and American economies were largely walled off from one another. Chinese and American economies remain, despite years of deliberate de-risking, bound together by trillions of dollars in trade, investment, and financial exposure. Some economists argue this interdependence makes catastrophic conflict less likely, since both nations have enormous incentives to avoid it. Others argue it simply means the stakes of confrontation and the potential for destabilizing shocks are higher than they were during the 20th century's Cold War. While the Pacific rivalry simmered, the sharpest and bloodiest edge of the new Cold War erupted in Europe. On February 24, 2022, Russian forces launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, attacking from the north, east, and south simultaneously in what Russian President Vladimir Putin called a special military operation aimed at the demilitarization and denazification of the country. Language Kyiv and its Western allies rejected as a pretext for a war of conquest against a sovereign, internationally recognized state. What followed was the largest land war in Europe since 1945. Russian forces, expecting a swift collapse of Ukrainian resistance, instead met fierce defense that stalled the initial assault on Kyiv within weeks. The war settled into a grinding, attritional conflict along shifting front lines in eastern and southern Ukraine, fought with a brutal combination of Soviet-era artillery doctrine and 21st-century drone warfare. Casualty estimates have varied enormously and remain difficult to verify independently, but by mid-2026, Western estimates placed Russian military casualties, killed and wounded combined, at roughly 1 million, with Ukrainian military casualties estimated in the hundreds of thousands. Staggering figures for a conflict many in early 2022 predicted would last only days. The war reshaped European security architecture almost overnight. Finland and Sweden, two nations that had maintained military non-alignment for decades, abandoned neutrality and joined NATO. Germany announced a historic reversal of its post-war defense posture, dramatically increasing military spending. The United States and European Union imposed the most extensive sanctions regime in modern history against a major economy, cutting Russia off from much of the Western financial system, freezing hundreds of billions in Russian central bank reserves, and banning key technology exports. Yet Russia proved more economically resilient than many Western officials predicted, rerouting oil and gas exports to China and India, building a shadow fleet of tankers to evade price caps, and adapting its economy to a wartime footing. The war also became a genuine proxy conflict in the classic Cold War sense. The United States, Britain, and European allies supplied Ukraine with increasingly advanced weapons systems, from HIMARS rocket artillery to Patriot air defense batteries to F-16 fighter jets, while North Korea supplied Russia with artillery shells and troops, and Iran supplied attack drones, reviving, almost precisely, the pattern of great powers arming opposing sides without directly fighting one another. By 2025 and into 2026, the war had entered its fourth year with no decisive breakthrough for either side. Russian forces made slow, grinding territorial gains measured in square miles per month rather than the sweeping advances of 2022, while Ukraine conducted deep strikes against Russian oil refineries and energy infrastructure hundreds of miles from the front. Diplomatic efforts, including a series of ceasefire proposals and direct talks brokered by the Trump administration, repeatedly stalled, complicated further by a separate war that broke out in the Middle East involving Iran. Polling in mid-2026 suggested a majority of both Russians and Ukrainians favored some form of negotiated settlement, even as neither government had accepted the other's terms, and strikes on both Kyiv and Russian cities continued into the summer. Beyond the battlefield, the war became a defining test of the new Cold War's information dimension. Both sides waged relentless propaganda campaigns aimed at domestic and international audiences. Disinformation spread through social media platforms became a weapon nearly as consequential as artillery, and the war forced European nations to confront, for the first time in a generation, the possibility of direct conflict with a nuclear-armed adversary. Putin repeatedly invoked Russia's nuclear arsenal in public statements throughout the war, a form of coercive signaling that historians have compared to the brinkmanship of the original Cold War's most dangerous moments, including the Cuban Missile Crisis. Though most analysts caution that today's nuclear risk, while real, has not approached that 1962 precedent. Zoom out far enough, and the new Cold War stops looking like two separate rivalries. Washington versus Beijing, Washington versus Moscow, and starts looking like something more fundamental. The slow, contested end of the unipolar moment that began in 1991, and the equally contested birth of whatever comes next. One of the clearest symptoms of this shift is the rise of institutions built explicitly outside Western control. The BRICS grouping, originally an informal acronym for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, expanded its membership in the 2020s to include Iran, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, Ethiopia, and other nations, positioning itself as a counterweight to the G7 and a forum for discussing alternatives to dollar-dominated global finance. China's Belt and Road Initiative has financed ports, railways, and power plants across dozens of developing nations, extending Beijing's economic and, at times, political leverage far beyond its borders. None of this constitutes a unified ideological bloc in the way the Warsaw Pact once did. China, Russia, India, and Iran have deeply divergent interests and historical rivalries of their own, but does represent a genuine erosion of the assumption that the Western-led order is the only viable path to development and security. Technology has become perhaps the single most defining battlefield of this new era, arguably more central than it ever was during the original Cold War. artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and advanced semiconductors are now treated by both Washington and Beijing as matters of core national security, not merely commercial competitiveness. Export controls, investment screening, and industrial policy, tools once associated with wartime economies, have become permanent features of peacetime governance in both countries. Analysts increasingly describe this contest using a term borrowed from finance: de-risking rather than full decoupling, acknowledging that the two economies remain too intertwined to separate cleanly, even as both governments work to reduce mutual dependence in the sectors they consider most strategically sensitive. What distinguishes this new Cold War from the old one, most historians agree, is its lack of a clean bipolar structure. The 20th century Cold War pitted two ideologically opposed superpowers, each anchoring a rigid alliance system, in a conflict that touched nearly every corner of the globe through proxy wars and covert operations. Today's rivalry is more fluid and multipolar. China and the United States compete economically and technologically while remaining each other's major trading partners. Russia and the West are locked in direct, lethal confrontation over Ukraine. China and Russia cooperate closely without being formal treaty allies in a large swath of the world's nations. India, Brazil, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, and others deliberately refuse to align fully with either camp, instead playing rival powers off one another to extract concessions, investment, and security guarantees from multiple sides at once. Some scholars argue this makes New Cold War a misleading label altogether, preferring terms like multipolarity, great power competition, or simply a more contested world order. What is not in dispute is the direction of travel. Defense spending has risen sharply across Europe and Asia. Military exercises near contested borders and straits have grown larger and more frequent. Supply chains for critical minerals, chips, and energy have become tools of statecraft rather than purely economic considerations. And a generation of leaders on every side now openly discusses the possibility of great power war in terms that would have seemed alarmist just 15 years ago. Whether this era ends the way the last Cold War did, with one side's economic and political system quietly outlasting the other, no shots ever fired directly between the great powers, or whether it ends through miscalculation in Taiwan, in Ukraine, or in some crisis not yet imagined, remains the defining open question of the 21st century. History rarely announces its turning points in advance. It only makes them obvious in hindsight.